Hopefully we've reacquired Doug. I'm not sure if we've got Doug on the other line or not. Is that you, Doug?
Yeah,
Okay.
you do. It never fails. I've noticed that whenever I mention demons, my phones usually go haywire. I don't know why that is.
Yeah, well.
But there seems to be a correlation between that. So anyway, I think I was talking about the fact that the common sort of doorway that all of the 2012 gurus seem to go through in order to talk about these things would be psychedelic drugs. And so, as I point out, and I think we haven't talked yet or mentioned yet some of the ancient initiates, such as the Theosophists, but about 120 years ago, Theosophy was becoming a major cult, and it certainly was predicting and advocating the very same things.
Well,
I don't know if you want to talk a bit about the history of that, or whether you want to go a different direction.
You want to talk about HPB? I know enough about this to be dangerous. So when I read it, I went, "Oh, okay, I know what he's talking about here." So yeah, let's do that and link it into what's going on here today, because I think it's fascinating for people to understand. There are a lot of trails. It isn't just the Mayan that ends up in 2012 here. So let's talk about Theosophy.
Yeah, exactly. No question that the Mayans, the Egyptians, we could go a lot of different directions, and we sort of end up on the same path. But yes, where a lot of these ideas, of course, the 2012 movement, you might call it, a lot of the writers essentially is built on the New Age movement of the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Essentially, the same concepts have been, what's happened is 2012 has been sort of added on to those same concepts. And 2012, they've sort of all agreed is sort of the omega point where all this begins to happen and comes together, where the New Age finally dawns. But if we look at history, we can go back to the end of the 19th century and find a couple of really interesting personalities. Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, HPV, as she was called, or sort of a self-imposed nickname, and then her partner in crime, a guy named Henry Steele Alcott, who has an interesting history as well. But as I mentioned in my book, both of these individuals surprisingly came together in New York City in 1875 and formed a new religion that they called, they would say was not a religion, called Theosophy. And essentially what they were trying to do, in their opinion, was to find what they thought was the best of all world religions and to marry that with the advances in science. And so they took what they considered to be the best in religion were certain elements of Buddhism and Hinduism, and to marry that with certain notions of sort of scientific findings. So words like evolution and things like that could be added into a vocabulary, for the most part, that was following the sort of the tenets of Hinduism. So a lot of folks would say that, well, this was built really on pantheism, the concept that all that is God, or that nature is God. But it's really animistic religion or pagan religion, the concept that there are many gods. And this is one of the ways that the New Age movement, while it owes much of its sort of religious dogma to Hinduism and Buddhism, it's slightly different in that it actually talks more about gods and our being gods as well, and that we can become gods who impose our will upon the wills of other gods that we encounter in the supernatural world. And so it really gets into some creepy areas, and what's astounding is you begin to study some of the more famous historical figures at the turn of going from, well, basically around 1901, the turn of the 20th century. You discover how many intellectuals, diplomats were up to their earlobes in Theosophy. And it becomes a religion that sort of the intellectuals adopted, which is always fascinating to me because it seems amazing that intellectuals would buy into such an amazing cosmology with all of these spirits and demons and so forth. but they did. And so as it turns out, long story short, the concept of theosophy was bought into by a certain group in Germany right after World War One, and in particular focused on a young private in the Army who they thought would be attractive to women who could speak forcefully. And they decided they placed their bets on a guy named Adolf Hitler. And it turns out that Hitler, as some people know, was very much tied into black magic and the occult, and was heavily influenced by a number of folks that taught Hitler a lot about black magic. Hitler himself took mescaline in order to encounter the supernatural. And so, as I point out in the book and in some subsequent papers I've written, that the path that the folks are recommending that we follow in order to achieve this higher consciousness and to sort of open the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley said, and break on through to the other side, as Jim Morrison at the Doors said, is to take mescaline, or is to take or to eat these magical mushrooms, and that we will then be able to encounter these spiritual beings, and we will then realize that our consciousness is capable of far more than just encountering the natural world, but we can also be a player, if you will, in the supernatural world. So it's kind of zany, but that is in fact where a lot of this stuff ends up.
Well, it's interesting. I'm just going through a list here of different individuals, famous theosophists, whatever. I'm looking at Lewis Carroll. I'm looking at James Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, T.S. Eliot, Kurt Vonnegut.
Edgar Allan Poe, H.G. Wells.
Yes.
Aleister Crowley, of course.
Yeah.
And of course, we don't have time to probably get into the linkage between all of this and Freemasonry, which I do in the book. But there's a very big connection from all of this. And of course, the way to simplify it and summarize it is that all of this ultimately ties into the universal world religion, which is simply paganism. And
all roads lead to God.
To the Garden of Eden, and the snake saying to Eve, "If you eat of the apple, you shall be as gods." And that knowledge is our salvation, is the root of salvation. And of course, that's so much of what is being taught by these writers, authors, and so-called experts.
I want to come back to this, but I want to finish sort of the whole corridor, and then I want to come back to the Nazis. Let's talk about the Mayans. Let's talk about this, what's it called? Long calendar? What do they call it?
The long count.
Long count, that's what it is, the long count. Let's talk about the Mayans, this long count calendar, and what's your interpretation of it all? Sure.
Well, just to give some sort of facts about the calendar, it's one of, I believe, 21 calendars that the Mayans have. They clearly, for one reason or another, became experts at tracking the stars, the planets, and eventually seemed to learn things that no one could possibly know, being earthbound. But the long count calendar is a calendar that basically refreshes itself about every 26,000 years. And there's actually 5 ages that are roughly 5,100 years. I think it's 5,126 or 5,130, depending upon how you round the numbers. And all of these, the age, the long count, all of these things conclude on December the 21st, 2012. And one of the better scholars, a guy named John Major Jenkins, who's written several books, but in his book about 2012 and what he called cosmovision or cosmogenesis, his view was that the Mayans determined that somewhere probably around 400 BC that this event of the sun eclipsing the dark rift of the Milky Way, that would occur in 2012. And so what he did was, or what he says they did, is they reset their calendars and calibrated them to that date. They believed that date would be hugely significant. And, of course, we don't know fully what they subscribed would happen on that date, but we do know that one of their famous games that they played in a courtyard where they kicked the ball around, and whoever won was put to death. It was an honor to be killed after winning the game. Was to kick this little ball into this little hole in the side of the wall, and that game was specifically tied in with the sun eclipsing the Milky Way, center of the Milky Way, in December of 2012. And so they seem to think it was a very, very significant event. And so the question then is why? Why did they think that? And of course, the theory or the speculation is that the Mayans, because of their great shamanistic powers, they took these drugs. They were, affected. The shamans were trained and were very impacted by the psilocybin from the mushrooms and from other types of what we consider toxins from toads and whatnot that they used as hallucinogenic drugs, and that they were able to, in effect, project their souls or their consciousness outside of themselves all the way to perhaps the galactic center. And that's what it's theorized, at least by many of the authors. And so that they were able to detect things like the fact that we were in a galaxy that was spiral in nature, and that so they consequently learned things and saw things that they obviously couldn't have seen if they were earthbound. And so many authors believe that that's in fact how they gained this kind of knowledge, and that's why they know so much about the heavens. So as far as whether that date ends up being significant, it is true that a number of cultures have also specified that date as a significant date. But there's also, of course, just a tremendous amount of speculation, which I spend quite a bit of time debunking a lot of the speculation because it's sort of exaggeration. It's not really scientific, and it's not necessarily the best interpretation of the data. But nevertheless, there are a number of cultures that believe something significant will happen in 2012. Again, the Judeo-Christian tradition doesn't believe that, per se, but a lot of these pagan religions tend to believe that. So anyway, so at the end of the day, one just says, well, it's a calendar. It believes it's a time of transformation. Like a lot of ancient cultures, it was very keen on the concept of ages, and that as ages pass, that we go from one type of age to the next. And so this is the marker that we will pass through, and then most of the modern writers, of course, just say, well, what it means is that we will all become more like shamans, and we will get in touch with this supernatural world. That's what they've concluded. Of course, they concluded that because so much of their belief is already based upon the New Age theology, if you will, that they have been reading about, studying, and advocating for the last 25, 30 years anyway.
I'm thrilled to have as my guest for about another 15 minutes is S. Douglas Woodward. Call him Doug. And the name of the book is Decoding Doomsday. You'll find links up on my Facebook, on our website, and I heartily commend this book to you. Doug, I want to go back just a little bit because I find it fascinating that just about everything that is wrong in this world today goes back to the Nazis. You look at the Muslim Brotherhood, formed in 1928, but it wasn't until the Nazis introduced the final solution to them in the 30s and 40s that their membership exploded, and they ended up with multiple millions. You look at Nazis and the idea of eugenics, which unfortunately is prevalent in the world today, and you look at the Nazis and their consumption with the occult, and even they're encouraging a lot of the thought that seemingly climaxes in 2012. And I step out of the parameter of your book for a minute, if you can. Mm-hmm. No man knows the time or hour, which means Satan doesn't know. And I had a pastor say to me once, Vince, I can't prove it in Scripture, But I just wonder if Satan, every generation, has had to have an Antichrist ready, because he doesn't know either. And obviously, Hitler was one of those. But not to anyway deify the man, but he was one twisted puppy. And man, I think you can see Satan's influence on a human being like maybe no other human being that I'm aware of. As far as, they were into everything that was satanic.
Absolutely true, and it goes so much further. I'd say that even let's say the average man or woman on the street would say, well, Hitler clearly was an evil character, but very few realize how far into occultic thinking this guy was, and how the types of rituals that they would get into, and the horrific sexual magic that they would practice, and it's just absolutely mind-boggling. And of course, we know that Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS, was even further into some of these crazy mythologies about the hollow earth, the war between fire and ice. It's almost as if there was no theory that was so outlandish that the Nazis wouldn't adopt it. And yet they seem to have, despite these crazy ideas that they had, they seem to have someone on their side, because just amazing coincidences would happen that would keep Hitler in power, and would cause the Germans to be successful in this time frame and what they were trying to achieve. And so there's no question that the supernatural in the 20th century, Hitler was, if he wasn't the Antichrist, he was probably the closest thing that we have ever seen that would resemble what we would anticipate the Antichrist to be. Probably, if anything, he was just too obvious.
Yeah.
And so I would speculate that the Antichrist, when he does arise, will probably not be quite as obvious as Hitler was, because Hitler was so thoroughly ensconced in the occult.
You look at the world. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, you finish up. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I was just going to comment that as we get into the 20th century and now into the 21st, that the same kinds of ideas that were very much prominent in Nazism, the concept of Aryanism, many of their myths, but especially the concepts of influencing the supernatural, of a select elite becoming very aware and able to manipulate the supernatural powers that exist. That was very much what they were about.
You look at the world today, and because we now do have the nation of Israel, and we look at biblical prophecy, and just about everything that needs to happen has happened. So the average Christian, at least in the late 20th century, was taught that, the end times are probably getting pretty close. And there are a significant number of Christians that are looking at what's happening in the world today going, come Lord Jesus. So we have that amongst the Christians. We have an angst in the world today because the economy is so shaky, because we've got the so-called apocalypse with birds and fish and seals dropping dead all around us. We've got all of these weird things. We've got a lot of seismic activity. We've got a lot of stuff going on. We've got weather. We've got food shortages. There's just this general anxiety in the world today. And then you have the 2012 prophecy, so-called. And it's almost as if 2012 gives energy, much like the millennium did. It gives a focal point for all of this anxiety. And I wonder if it's just that. It's just everybody is so scared, so worried, so anxious because this world is in flux legitimately, that they focus on something, and 2012 is what they've gravitated to.
Well, certainly it's kind of the classic line about the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
If we all get together and we all believe the world's going to come to an end, lo and behold, really bad things start to happen, and so there's no question that's part of it. The perspective I have, which I share in the book, though, is that it's very likely to be a huge deception. To some extent, for many, it'll be a huge letdown because once again, it will have appeared that something, fantastic, extraordinary, supernatural is going to happen, and it just simply didn't. Now, does that mean that we won't experience great earthquakes, perhaps cataclysmic weather, another financial bust? All these things could happen. It's almost predictable that any bad thing that happens, the folks that are advocates for 2012 will jump up and say, "See there, told you so." We could expect that. That's just common human behavior. But at the end of the day, the real question is this going to be deceptive to people? And then, once burned, twice shy. Will people then say, "Gee, we all believe that 2012 is going to happen, and it didn't." Didn't people say that about the Y2K thing, that the world was going to end then? And yep, unfortunately, there were a number of Christian evangelists that said, "Yep, the Y2K thing, right on the year 2000, that's when the Lord's coming back." And of course, their answer is that we don't know exactly when this is going to occur. And yet, Vince, it's interesting that. Whenever anyone talks about the apocalypse, usually a Christian that has a relatively good handle in their Bible will say, "Well, the Lord said that no one will know, not even He Himself, only the Father in heaven will know the day when Jesus will come back." But on the other hand, the Lord also taught us that as soon as you see all these signs coming together, when you see all these signs happening, then lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. And then he sort of underscored that even further by saying, heaven and earth could pass away, but my words will never pass away. So it's as if he was saying, it's more likely, once you see all these signs coming to pass, the inevitability of my coming, it's so real, it's more likely that the whole universe would dissolve back into nothingness than that my words will not come to pass, i.e. that I won't be coming back. And so we're sort of caught between those two realities in biblical teachings, and both are true. And the real question we have to ask ourselves is, are all of the signs, have they come to pass? And I think the answer is yes. And so, as I said, I'm not going to set a date, but my head, I am looking up. Well, I do think the time grows close.
Let me throw a couple of things at you here, because it's interesting, and I don't believe in coincidence. Interviewing a fellow by the name of L.A. Marzulli, you don't necessarily have to buy into everything that L.A. has to say, but I think he's on the right track when he says that UFOs are tied to demonic activity. I believe that. But I asked him about 2012, and he said, Vince, I think 2012 is going to be the biggest self-fulfilling prophecy in the history of man. Now, don't comment on that yet. Just hold that on one side of your brain and understand, or at least we know that we battle not with flesh and blood, but spirits and principalities, and it makes sense that Satan will do everything he can to use 2012 to his best advantage. Now, you just said something that to me was really insightful, and it dovetails with something that another person that I really like reading, his name is Don Koenig, and he is not a prophet, but he knows end times prophecy really well, and he comments on world events relative to what's in the Bible. And he said, we need to go a little bit further down the road as far as scoffers vis-a-vis Peter, where it talks in the Word where at the end people will be scoffers and saying, you've been saying for years the end is coming, and it's not coming, it still hasn't come. And I see 2012, as you just sort of in a backhanded way articulated, 2012 playing into this and creating even more in the way of scoffing and I know the word I want, but it won't come to me, but we'll use scoffing. The people are going to be mocking and laughing, and that, you goofy Christians, you've been saying Jesus is coming back, Y2K, 2012, it never happens, it ain't going to happen, and then all of a sudden, boom, Jesus goes, hi, how you doing?
Except I don't think that's what he's going to say.
No.
Oh, exactly right. That's my point. Is that there's perhaps there's a sense that has been going on for thousands of years amongst the spirits on the other side of the battle, if you will, that they know that when we get into the seventh millennium, from the standpoint of biblical genealogy, i.e., we get into the 21st century, that their time is very short. And I don't believe that they know the day or the hour, but they probably know their time is growing short. And so I don't believe 2012 is the day, but I think we're getting close. But nevertheless, to the point you're making, which is kind of the point I was making earlier, it's crying wolf, right? If we have cried wolf too many times, then we've actually done ourselves a huge disservice. That's why it's just not smart for us to glom on to the 2012 thing and try to find ways that it also reinforces that the Lord is coming soon. I would say, keep in mind, almost all of these sources are animistic, pagan, occult, and so we do not want to be joined to those sources. Our source doesn't specify that date, and but it does say that the time is growing near, and to watch, because you don't know when that day is coming, when the Lord shall return. But once you see all these things coming to pass, you better realize that His coming is inevitable.
We all, as Christians, we all have people, and again, I want to remind you, we're talking with Doug Woodward, and his book, brilliant, Decoding Doomsday, links on my Facebook and website, Crossing the World, to get to Doug's book. Buy it. Doug, we all have people in our circle who aren't saved, that aren't Christians. How are you going to be sharing and witnessing over the course of this next 18 months or so relative to 2012? Sort of help us in maybe giving us a tactic or a strategy to use 2012 for our best benefit and for the cause of Christ. How are you going to be handling this?
Well, personally myself, of course, I'm going to be doing quite a bit of writing. We're doing some speaking. I'll be doing some interviews such as tonight. I appreciate very much the chance to do this tonight. But in terms of the message that I intend to convey, is probably succinctly that 2012 may not be the time of Christ's return. It probably isn't. But we would be foolish to look past all of the things that are happening in the world and conclude that this isn't a crisis time for humanity. It is a crisis time. And, I don't have to tell you of all of the different things that are going on in the world right now that point that out. And so I will downplay the date, but emphasize that the apocalyptic fears that we have may well be founded, and it's very much time for you to check out the book that unlocks the future far, far, far in more detail than any other source. And as I say in my book, Christian scholarship has been around for 2,000 years, and you have thousands and thousands of scholars that have helped us to understand what the Bible teaches. When it gets to the 2012 theory, there's only a handful of scholars that have really been probing around this for about 20 years, and so there's just simply no comparison. So much more to be understood about what the Scripture teaches. And so, I would tell people, if you're interested in 2012, then you better really get interested in understanding exactly what's going to happen. And you need to get a book that's written by someone that believes in the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and study that. That will tell you what's going to happen in the years ahead.
Well, I saw a program, I can't remember what it was called, but they were saying, and when we look at the greatest prophets of all time, like Nostradamus and Casey and the Hopi Indians and the Mayans, and I'm sitting there going, Ezekiel, Isaiah, the Apostle John,
Daniel.
What? And folks right now, they are looking for answers, and they are in love with prophecy. And it seems to me that the book that's never been wrong, Never. Maybe that's the one we ought to be looking at, rather than, this goofy and that. And maybe if we look at it this way, squint an eye and look through that. No, man, let's just go look at a book that's hit it on for thousands of years. They've been right on. This Jesus guy, did you know that they prophesied his coming a whole lot of years before he showed up here? The coming back together of Israel, did you know that was prophesied 2,000 years plus ago? So, brother, you
couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. It's remarkable that somehow Nostradamus is considered politically correct.
Yeah.
To cite his very very opaque, obtuse. Well, they're not obtuse. They're more just very difficult to understand prophecies, and yet someone that's prophesied as clearly as Daniel did. About the kingdoms of the world, the first coming of the Messiah, laying out a specific timeline, etc. That he's never mentioned. It's remarkable, but it just tells you once again that unfortunately our media is not controlled by folks that are wanting to play fair.
No, they aren't. They definitely are. Brother, are you going to be anywhere in the Missouri area? I mean, we're spreading across the whole globe slowly but surely, but there are still our core listenership is in Missouri. Are you going to be in Missouri anytime in the next year that you're aware of that people will be able to come see you?
Yes, actually, I've been invited to participate with Tom Horn in the conference in Branson, Missouri. I believe it's like July 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, that time frame. And I will be speaking probably on the higher consciousness issue in 2012. I think I'm going to be the sort of the 2012 expert that they're including in the conference. Happy to be there. There's a lot of other folks, of course, that are great. Randall Price, Gary Stearman, Chuck Missler. So there's some phenomenal speakers that will be there. And so I plan to be there for several days in that time frame, and I would look forward to meeting you in person, and perhaps we can get together with some of your listeners.
That was my hope, actually, is maybe even have you in the studio live, or we'll be talking before then for sure. But, man, it was a joy and a pleasure, and I pray a real blessing on you, your book, and your ministry. And I look forward to us talking again soon. So, Doug, God bless you, my friend, and thank you for doing this. All right, brother. Stay well.
Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you again.